Mets and Knicks were in Game 5 when O.J. started that fateful drive. His four-way hazard lights were blinking, and no one knew what the Jews was thinking.
I've been to Reno, Chicago, Fargo, Minnesota, Buffalo, Toronto, Winslow, Sarasota, Wichita, Tulsa, Ottawa, Oklahoma, Tampa, Panama, Mattawa, La Paloma, Bangor, Baltimore, Salvador, Amarillo, Tocopilla, Barranquilla, and Padilla, I'm killed. I've been everywhere, man. I've been everywhere, man. Crossed the desert bare, man. I breathe the mountain air, man. I've traveled, I've had my share, man. I've been everywhere.
This is Oversight Live, your advocate for good governance. We're putting the site back in. Oversight. Here's the watcher on the wall, your host, Ben Carpenter.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Oversight Live. I am Ben Carpenter. I will be your host for tonight. Thanks for joining us. Oversight Live exists to bring you information from our state capital in Juneau. As most Alaskans know, it is prohibitively expensive, both in time and money, for Alaskans to go to our state capital because there are no roads. You have to fly or take a ferry to get there, and it is a long ways away from where most Alaskans live. We're talking days commitment if you're going to drive, and it's expensive. Plane tickets, hotels, meals. It's expensive to go provide oversight of our government. So here we are. We've got an excuse and a reason why we cannot provide oversight, and we've got technology that can help us provide oversight. So not having a road is not a completely legitimate excuse anymore. So Oversight Live is going to do our best to bring you relevant and timely content that does not have a liberal media bias to it. I am a fiscal conservative, a social conservative, and so you're going to have that bias. But I'm going to do my best to bring you raw information. You'll have my commentary, but I'm going to let you know where to go find the information if you want to go find it yourself. While you're listening and watching live, you have the opportunity to ask questions. If you don't understand something or want to present a different perspective, whatever it is, if you want to engage, then you can do that. Just chat in your social media app. We're broadcasting on YouTube, X, and Facebook. I'll get that message live, and I'll do my best to answer your question or engage with you. If you're watching the recording, then you can send me an email and I'll attempt to do the same, just not live. Maybe I'll bring it up on a future meeting. That email address is producer@oversightllive.com. If you've got a really good question, don't be surprised if I use it on air here. If it's you're engaging with me live, I'm going to show it and edify everyone. If it's it's a good question, and there are no dumb questions in my opinion. This conversation of government oversight, sometimes we're watching people speak a foreign language almost, government speak, and it needs some sort of translation in some cases. So if you've got questions, don't feel bad about that. Asking questions is how we learn. If you've got the question and you never ask, then likely you're never going to learn. And that's the worst case scenario. So best case scenario is you ask a question and we get an answer for you. I spent 6 years in the state legislature, in the state house specifically, and I didn't have legislative experience before I went. And I now have a better understanding of what it takes to operate down there and kind of the inner workings behind the scenes, and I can answer questions. So that's what I am going to attempt to do. If you want to be a better steward of your government and you want to provide better oversight and better recommendations or requests or influence on your elected representatives, then ask me the questions and I will do my best to get you an answer as I see it in life. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to try to have fun doing it because sometimes this can be a bore, but it can also be fun. We're standing up and we're being adults and we're doing what's required to maintain freedom in our country. And as Ronald Reagan said, freedom's never more than one generation away. We've got to fight for it. Every generation's got to choose to engage and sacrifice and do what's necessary to maintain that freedom. All right. So tonight we're going to continue the conversation that we had last night. We spent more than 2 hours watching Senate Resources talk about the gas pipeline project. And tonight, so there was another meeting today, and Senate Resources took up the remainder of the presentation by Dan Stickle with the Department of Revenue. And I've got that queued up, and we can listen to that. But I also wanted to take this time, and I think it's important to do up front because it's shaping the conversation that you see in the following meetings here. This is a meeting from the 23rd of January. It is also from Senate Resources, and it is a meeting where Senate Resources invited in GaffneyCline, who is the Legislature's paid consultant on oil and gas matters. Probably very few people have paid attention and were watching what happened in that meeting in January, right? Because now we're dealing. Back in January, we had just learned that Glenfarne was going to be taking over this project, right? So there was some reactions and whatnot. So the implications here are going to speak for itself, and there's some additional context that I can provide. But it's important for you and I to know where the advice of the legislature is coming from, and how that might be shaping the conversations that we're having or that we're witnessing happen right now. So let me bring up that presentation and we'll get started here. All right. This is Senate Resources from the January 23rd meeting. And good evening, everyone.
Here from the legislature's consultant, GaffneyCline. And here today in person is Nick Fulford. He is the Senior Director of Gas, LNG, and Energy Transitions at GaffneyCline. And online, perhaps, is Andrew Duncan. He is the Director of Facilities and Costs at Gaffney-Cline Energy. So welcome, Mr. Fulford, who's here in person. So I'm speaking directly to you. Mr. Fulford, I don't know quite where you were going to begin, but I'll kind of start it out here. You had forwarded to me a letter it's actually on the stationery of GaffneyCline and Baker Hughes. Members have it at their desks, and if it's not uploaded on the website yet, it will be. But it addresses the topic of conflicts of interest and confidentiality. Do you wish to review this prior to your presentation?
Thank you, Chair Giesel. I think with your permission, I'd like to offer a brief statement to the committee, particularly in the light of some of the discussions that's taken place. So for the record, my name is Nicholas Fulford, Senior Director at GaffneyCline. So before starting our presentation today, I'd like to offer this brief statement really about the scope of our studies and in particular the measures that we take to ensure that our analysis, reports and recommendations remain independent, objective and reliable. So as an energy consulting company with nearly 70 years experience now in the industry, the integrity of our work is a core requirement and obviously a competitive strength. Since GaffneyCline was acquired by Baker Hughes back in 2008, Safeguards have been in place to ensure that client data, project analysis carried out by GaffneyCline are restricted and accessible only to the GaffneyCline team members directly engaged on supporting a client. So as the committee is aware, I think it was 9 days prior to our first presentation on the LNG project on November the 19th, Baker Hughes announced that it had entered into an agreement with Glenfarne related to the Alaska LNG project. So I'd like to emphasize that due to the established procedures and separation measures we have in place, none of the GaffneyCline personnel responsible for preparing our report or indeed conducting our analysis are involved in or indeed aware of the discussions between Baker Hughes and Glenfarne. No additional communications have occurred since that announcement. So GaffneyCline affirms that the preparation of this report and our presentation today has been conducted independently and without any input or influence from other business units or affiliates of Baker Hughes. Moreover, no information contained in our study has been shared with or derived from any other entity within Baker Hughes corporate group, except where expressly required under applicable law or contractual terms. So obviously, we've been working with the legislature many years now, and given the reliance on our advice at this and other committees, we believe it's essential to be fully transparent about these circumstances, and we welcome any questions that you might have regarding our work or processes, or indeed the safeguards that ensure the independence and objectivity of our analysis. So appreciate the opportunity to offer those comments.
Thank you, Mr. Fulford.
So let me pause there for just a second. And for those that are not aware, GaffneyCline has been a consultant for the legislature. I was going to say on and off, but I don't think there's been an off, technically. I think they've been a consultant for the legislature for decades. Okay. I think they're one of the go-to advisors that the legislature has gone to time and time again for advice on oil and gas matters, taxation matters, all of that. Okay. While I was in the legislature, I served as the legislative budget and audit chair. One of the requirements or the duties of the legislative budget and audit was to engage in seeking contracts for consultancy for the legislature. So the chair of the resources committee, either in the House or the Senate, would contact me as the chair of the legislative budget and audit committee and ask for a consultant. And we would go back and forth, make sure we understand exactly what they're looking for. And then we would go seek to put a contract out and do the contract process to bring that consultant on. So what I can tell you is that when I looked for an additional consultant specifically to deal with this issue, we put out a contract request. We initially got one respondent, GaffneyCline. There was a second one. It was interest, but it wasn't full interest. Okay, and that was a company out of Texas. Okay. There is a very small number of consultants with subject matter expertise of Alaska specific oil and gas history, market, all of that. Very small number. It may be one or two. I'm going off memory here. The challenge that we have as a state is because we are so small, finding people to deal with or enter into an arrangement with the state government, with the legislature, to provide advice on such a small market. It was a challenge for me to find somebody other than GaffneyCline, and we ended up with a contract, renewing the contract with GaffneyCline. And if you remember, several years ago, there was a conflict because the governor signed GaffneyCline and the legislature wanted to sign GaffneyCline, but the contract with the legislature had expired. This was in transition between when I came on, and actually it expired during the first 6 months of my tenure as the committee chair, but I was completely unaware. I didn't realize that was going to happen. So the contract expired. The governor picked up GaffneyCline as a consultant, and then the legislature's like, well, wait a second, how can we ask GaffneyCline to continue to be a consultant for us if they're also a consultant for the executive branch? Because now it doesn't make sense, right? We're supposed to be separate entities. Well, as we're going to find out tonight, GaffneyCline is wholly owned by Baker Hughes, and Baker Hughes is now partnered with Glenfarne for this project. So it murkies the water. What the statement that we just heard from Nick Fulford with GaffneyCline was that the two business interests remain separate. Okay. Except where by law and by contract, they're required to share information. But for you and I, and for the legislature, as you're going to see, major trust issues here, right? Major trust issues. What's the alternative? So if Senator Giesel immediately in January went to Legislative Budget and Audit and said, hey, we need to find a new consultant. And this may be information that I can find. I did not, prior to this meeting, go and look at Legislative Budget and Audit online to see if they have put an RFI out for another consultant. That process is going to take months. Like, I don't, even if they had started in January, they're not going to have a consultant by the end of the session. Okay. So the legislature is stuck. They're literally stuck with having GaffneyCline provide them information going forward. And so it's going to be up to us, the public, up to the legislature to scrutinize what's being provided. And I guess just ask, does it pass the common sense test, and does it make sense, right? Because there is a perception of a bias there. Anyway, that being said, it's what we have. It's the advice that we have. So let's hear the response of the committee here real quick.
Committee members, any questions? This has been, the committee members have indicated no questions, so I'll proceed. This was a significant question that came forward when we became aware of the ownership Baker Hughes holds over Gaffney-Klein. Mr. Fulford, the letter is, I'm thankful for the letter. Thank you for bringing it forward. But you know, when I go to the Baker Hughes website, you're listed as Senior Director of Gas LNG with Baker Hughes, and there's Gaffney-Klein. I'm having difficulty finding the separation here. I'm certainly no attorney, though we have several sitting at the table, but it's my understanding that there is a responsibility on your part to make every effort to support the success of the owner company, that being Baker Hughes, who now is affiliated with Glenfarne, who is 75% owner of our project. And so I'm struggling to feel comfortable that there's actually a separation and that you are actually advising us to the benefit of us versus Baker Hughes, who owns you.
Thank you for your comments.
Okay, I want to pause here for just a second and point out, GaffneyCline is our consultant. We have paid for them. We have a contract with them, and it's in force. Otherwise, they wouldn't be here. Why criticize them at this point? This is where this is going to go here for a few minutes. It's like, why drag them through the mud? You knew that they were owned by Baker Hughes when we put a contract out, right? They're our consultant. They're probably the only choice that you have with respect to a company that's been paying attention to Alaska politics and Alaska oil and gas and all of that for years. They're likely your only go-to source right now for somebody with the experience that GaffneyCline has in the state of Alaska. And now you're going to drag them through the mud just because of who they're owned by. This goes to my earlier statement in previous meetings that I think there's a bias from this committee about Glenfarne. They don't want to see Glenfarne succeed. Even to the point of pointing out and making a public spectacle of their own consultant that they hired. I think strange.
And it's certainly over the years, occasionally the world of GaffneyCline and the world of Baker Hughes start to interact a little bit. And in those circumstances, clients quite rightly seek additional assurances in terms of how data is being used and separated. On occasions, we require additional constraints and separations to occur internally in terms of where data is stored, etc. And certainly if this is one of those occasions, now with the announced relationship between Baker Hughes and Glenfarne, further measures over and above the ones that were set out in our letter and the ones I've talked about today, I'm sure could be put in place. Ideally, our goal is to satisfy your requirements as a major client. And obviously anything we can do to help with that, we will seek to put in place for you.
I would definitely like to see in writing what those separations are. But let me ask you, if we consulted you for advice, perhaps on legislation that we're writing or whatnot, and that question, you would be at and you were at a crossroads of either advising us to the benefit of the state of Alaska and to the detriment of perhaps the detriment to Baker Hughes Glenfarne, where would you fall? Would you give the advice to the state of Alaska that would benefit the state of Alaska, or would you be supporting Baker Hughes and the Glenfarne owners?
What do you expect somebody to give an answer to in that regard? Like, hey, lady, you hired me. I didn't hire you. You put an RFI out. You asked for consultancy. We said, hey, we'll be your consultant. You hired us. If you've got questions about my credibility or whether I'm going to provide wisdom to you, go find a different consultant. Like this whole line of questioning is bizarre. The chair and likely the Democrats on the committee here are using this opportunity to put a black eye on the project, even though the consultancy is their request. The legislature is now going to say, oh, well, you know what? The consultant that we have is biased and subject to scrutiny on our part, which I'm not arguing that. But if that's the case, then go find yourself another consultant. Put an emergency order out. Get another consultant. Why drag them through the mud here in this regard? It doesn't make any sense.
Did that fall?
Thank you for those observations, Chair Giesel. I might draw a parallel with expert witness work that we do for international arbitrations or courts, where in those circumstances, our clear duty is to provide objective, independent advice to the court or the arbitrator. So that discipline around independence and objective advice is a thread that kind of runs through the business, I would say. And, there have been, for example, there have been occasions where that expert witness work has seen us being working against major clients and so forth. But ultimately, it's those guidelines governing the independence and the objectiveness of our advice, which is a core company value, if you like.
GaffneyCline is a wholly owned subsidiary of Baker Hughes.
Since 2008, yes, Chair Giesel.
So in that structure, my understanding is that you have a fiduciary responsibility to Baker Hughes as an employee of GaffneyCline. Correct?
She's not an attorney. She's now,
I think the
figuring
the
something out that
interpretation
someone's
of
told her.
my fiduciary duty is a tricky one to comment on in this context. Ultimately, the GaffneyCline business model and the way in which we are measured in GaffneyCline is on our independent advisory work that we do with clients around the world. So in that sense, my fiduciary duty is to maintain the quality and the value of that independent advice, because without it, clearly GaffneyCline and ultimately the parent company would suffer.
Well, this is a pretty unique situation. We have a mega project where the documentation, the fiscals, the contracts, etc., everything is confidential. And yet your parent company, you are a wholly owned subsidiary of, is part of that project. And you're supposed to be advising us on how best to get the best deal for the state of Alaska.
Mm-hmm.
This seems pretty complicated to me. The courts have ruled that a wholly owned subsidiary has a unity of interest with that entity. In other words, Baker Hughes and GaffneyCline. So I'm trying to feel confident that faced with all this confidentiality and yet knowing that your parent company is part of the documentation that's confidential from us, that I'm not.
Are we going to receive the same scrutiny when we're discussing LNG imports and an N-Star parent company owning the LNG that we would be importing from Canada? Are we going to receive this same level of scrutiny with regard to biases and directions that certain individuals may want to go when N-Star's parent company stands to gain if we don't have a pipeline? I mean, is this part of the is this line of questioning going to continue when we have conversations about LNG import terminals? Like, you're crying over spilt milk here. You asked GaffneyCline to be the consultant. You knew that they were owned by Baker Hughes. And that happened before Baker Hughes becomes a customer or a partner in the LNG pipeline with Glenfarne. And now you're going to criticize the consultant that you hired prior to that happening? Like, this conversation doesn't even need to happen. If you don't trust that GaffneyCline is going to give you the pertinent information, then find another consultant. If it's that big of a deal that you're going to bring them before the public and make a spectacle out of this, where they're left to defend their credibility off of a decision that was made that is not it's not even part of the consultancy decision here. If that's what you feel, that somehow their consultancy is going to be tainted, then this is like a put up or shut up moment. Like, go find a different consultant. Or maybe that's not the objective here. Maybe the objective is to just drag this project through the mud and find reasons why we can't make it go forward.
I'm quite sure how confident we can be in your advice. Can you help me with that?
So I think, Chair Giesel, I really appreciate your concerns and your willingness to open up the discussion today. I think the nature of the dialogue is perhaps getting a little beyond my own sort of area of expertise to be able to comment on. My legal colleagues helped me with the basis of opinion and the expressions of the comments today. And I think I should probably refer to them for any additional advice.
Very good.
He
Well,
didn't write
I appreciate the
right out and say it, but yeah, I can. He's like, you hired me, lady. Like, go find somebody else.
fact that GaffneyCline opened the conversation today by sending me the letter. You heard the concerns at the Legislative Budget and Audit Committee a month ago, and I appreciate that you acknowledged, not you personally, but GaffneyCline and Baker Hughes acknowledged that this is a concern and apparently acknowledged that it's a valid concern since I received the letter. So I'm going to have you continue with your presentation today, but understand that this question is still lingering. And I would like to see more legal clarity here.
We're putting
So,
you on notice, buddy.
Please proceed with your presentation.
Just ask one question.
A question from Senator Wielechowski.
We've used GaffneyCline. I remember using you in 2007 back in ACES and found your, I don't know if it was yours, but found the analysis of GaffneyCline to be very, very helpful. And I know you're representing oil companies at the time as well. Are there other sovereigns that you represent where there's potential an adverse or different interest with Baker Hughes?
Thank you, Senator Wielechowski. I suppose one comment I would offer is that I believe there is Baker Hughes equipment in about 80 or 90% of the LNG plants around the world. So in that sense, any time that we're advising an investor or a lender or a sovereign state, potentially there's always that slight overlap. Clearly in this case, it's been brought to the fore because of the very active dialogue between, Glenn Farn and yourselves. But certainly from an LNG perspective, the division of Baker Hughes that entered into the agreement with Glenn Farn, that focuses on equipment, providing plant and so forth. And as I say, that same dialogue happens with probably almost every LNG project in the world.
So it's not unique, as Chair Giesel put out. Oh, this is a unique situation here. No, if you're going to ask GaffneyCline to be your consultant, let me back up and say the oil industry as a whole is a very small industry. We look at it and we say, wow, look at all of the dollars and all of the different locations and countries and all of that. But when you really boil it down, it's a small industry. Okay. And Nick is pointing this out. He's like, you're not going to be able to have a conversation about any sort of company or LNG facility or state or nation that doesn't have Baker Hughes involved in it, because Baker Hughes is huge. They're a big player in the industry. So you can't get away from it. There's a business model here that GaffneyCline has to maintain some credibility if they're going to stay in business. Like their byproduct or the product that they produce for their clients. If too many of the clients are like, yeah, we don't like your product, we don't trust your product because you've got a relationship with Baker Hughes, then they wouldn't be in business. The private market, the private sector is not going to reward that. The only way they stay in business is through the trustworthiness of their consultancy. And I don't know, maybe the consultancy that they do is just a government contract consultancy. They're not actually maintaining consultancies with private interests, private businesses. Maybe this is Baker Hughes's way to tap into federal and state money or national money, sovereign money, right? Because the only people that they provide, the only entities that they provide consultancy to are government entities. I don't know. I'm just speculating here. But the bottom line here is, if you don't trust GaffneyCline, then go find a different consultant. It just so happens you're in a pickle. You're bent over a barrel because You don't have the time to go find another one, and I don't know that you're actually going to find one that's going to want to do business with the state of Alaska legislature. It's a pickle. Again, I just look at this whole conversation as lacking professionalism from the legislature's point of view. You're making a big deal out of something that you should just recognize. Hey, look, conditions have changed. GaffneyCline is our consultant. Prior to Glenfarne coming on board, there's no problem that they're a subsidiary of Baker Hughes. That hasn't been a problem since 2008, and we've kept them on as consultants. So what's the problem now? Oh, okay, now there's a conflict because Baker Hughes has entered into a conversation with Glenfarne and is partnering, and now that's color. Okay, so professional says if that's a problem for us, then we need to find another consultant. You don't blame the consultant for it. They didn't make the decision to have Glenfarne and Baker Hughes come together. Like, either you trust them or you don't. Shut up and color. Like, get a new consultant or ask this guy what his opinion is.
Obviously, it's particularly obvious here because of the commentary that we've seen in the press.
Follow up, Senator Wilkowski.
I share your concerns, Madam Chair. I wish we had it. And I'd feel more comfortable if we had someone completely not affiliated with Baker Hughes. I know in the industry, it's I don't know that that's possible. And I know you've been working with the state of Alaska for at least 20 years, probably. So I'm interested to hear your testimony, but I share your concerns.
Thank you, Senator Wilkowski. I'll let you proceed, Mr. Fulford.
Okay, thank you very much, Chair Giesel. And really following the direction that we've been given in terms of today's hearing, there's really three broad areas that we'd like to cover, and I'll just advance the slides. So first of all, obviously, there's been a lot of discussion about property tax and the request to mitigate that or offer concessions. So part of today's presentation talks about how that's been handled in Texas and Louisiana, and also Maryland, which is, I think, a relevant and interesting example. The other area of interest, I think, which is quite relevant to today's hearing and indeed the project, is activity just south of us here on the Canadian coast, not just with LNG Canada, but some of the other projects that are evolving there. You know, with the announcements yesterday and with the continuing sort of development of the project that being led by Glenfarne, the other thing which I think is useful to spend some time on is to look back to Senate Bill 138 and some of the measures which were followed through from that. And then finally, I'd like to ask my colleague Andrew Duncan, who's online today. He's from GaffneyCline office in Singapore. He has a lot of experience on FID readiness and that side of the equation, which
okay, so they're about done with the basically the agenda of their presentation, and they're going to get a blessing from the committee to go forward with this. Thanks, Lisa, for pointing that out. This is exactly what I was talking about. Baker Hughes and Glenfarne coming on board well after the consultancy was established with GaffneyCline.
As I'm sure many of you here know, Louisiana is probably one of the major hubs for Gulf Coast LNG projects. And the issue of property tax has been addressed not only for LNG plant, but, you know, all sorts of other hydrocarbon and manufacturing facilities. So there's a generic statute in Louisiana which provides for property tax relief for major industrial projects. There's technically an influence, a factor about, you know, the quality jobs which are being created. So, you know, sometimes people look at the sort of property tax concession per job being created, and certainly LNG typically does not have a high number of jobs attached to it. So, as I say, the statute in Louisiana provides for up to 80% property tax relief for up to 10 years. So it's worth pointing out that the way in which taxable value is determined in Louisiana property tax is different to here in Alaska.
Okay, folks. Gonna do a little bit of quick math here. 100 mils, 10%. If you remember from yesterday's presentation, the tax here is what? 20 mils, 2%. What is an 80% reduction from 100 mils? I know I went to public school, but I think an 80% reduction of 100 mils is 20 mils. Right where we're at with this conversation in our state. Okay. So the question then becomes, is it the mills issue or is it other issues with regard to property tax and the feasibility of this particular project? Okay. Keep that in mind for scale. Louisiana starts at 100 mils. We're starting at 20 mils.
In the sense that it's an ongoing valuation, which obviously takes into account a number of factors. So certainly the plan is that after the property tax concession, the regular property tax arrangements would return. And for Louisiana, that's about 100 mils of property tax rate on the plant and equipment. One of the questions which has arisen in Louisiana is the same one that I think is under discussion here, which is really the value of those tax concessions and the impact on the state's residents, obviously in exchange for these very large economic benefits. So on the table here, we have some typical property tax rebates and their value over the 10-year rebate. Sabine Pass is perhaps the largest. One of the reasons for that is that, it's a major LNG facility, which is, I think, pushing past 30 million tons per annum now. Cameron LNG, which is owned by Sempra, similar property tax benefit. Then the next two projects are owned by Venture Global. Calcasieu Pass has been in operation for a couple of years. Plaquemine has just started in operation. So also on this list is Magnolia LNG, which is owned by Glenfarne. And the estimated property tax benefit for that project is about $500 million. So certainly for Louisiana, property tax concessions have been a central theme of the LNG development. And as I say, the statute which allows this to happen was put in place some time ago and applies across the board to any major investment in the state. So that provides, one example of how property tax is dealt with. Actually, the last point on this slide, the 80% reduction in property tax for 10 years, there are other mechanisms for further tax concessions, and I think one or two projects have more or less negotiated that property tax down to zero, at least for 10 years.
Before you go, questions? Members of the committee? Senator Kawasaki, you had a question?
Yeah, thanks. I'm just trying to think of this apples to apples. So right now we've got a 20 mil rate on oil and gas property taxes across the state. What is that here for Louisiana? What are you saying that is, or without the incentives?
One way of looking at it is a 100 mils that has a much slower decline rate than you do here in Alaska, compared to 200 mils that declines based on depreciation. So in that sense, the major effect would be one of discount rate and time value of money. As I've mentioned in previous discussions about LNG, the impact of upfront near-term costs for the project are disproportionately high because of the way in which particularly private investors would look at time value of money and discount rates. So that there's two factors at play. One is the mill rate, but perhaps the more important one is the profile associated with the property tax.
Okay. That's industry speak, heavy industry speak. Okay. when he's saying profile, when he's saying discount rate, those are industry speak. My understanding, because I'm not in the industry, so my understanding, discount rate is your interest rate. So as we saw yesterday in the presentation, they were talking about a 5%. The cost of money would be 5%. That's what he's talking about here. What is the discount rate? Well, in what we heard yesterday, discount rate assumed to be 5%. What he's saying is it's not just the property tax piece of this, but it is the profile of the project that is important to the success of the project. The profile of the Alaska project includes the risk or the assumption that we're going to get sued if we have a property tax situation with how we do our money or do our taxation piece of this, because somebody's going to balk at the valuation of the entities, of the structures that the state is going to be taxing through property tax. Okay. And that is what Glenfarne has come back and said, that in order to get the profile risk down so that you have lower, I was going to say interest rate, but the term that they were using is the discount rate. So you lower the discount rate, it means you lower the risk. If you're going to have higher risk, meaning you have a property tax and there's a risk for getting sued over the valuation, then the people who are going to be lending you money are going to expect a higher interest rate because there's higher risk, a higher discount rate. Okay. When those rates go up, when the cost of the project goes up because of that risk, that's the cost of the gas going up. So you and I, who are going to be gas payers, gas buyers, right? We want to see a project go forward that's going to put a downwards pressure on the cost of gas. And that's our constitutional value of the gas. Okay. Somebody's going to make an argument that, well, we've got to make as much money off of taxation as possible because we have this constitution in Alaska, this constitutional provision that we maximize the resource for all of Alaskans. And these pro-government people are going to say, well, that means taxes. That means money coming to us. That's the value. Well, that's only one way of counting value. Another way of counting value would be, hey, we have gas. We have copious amounts. We have lots of gas, and it's going to have lots of gas for generations. And that's going to have a positive impact on the economy, on the growth of our private sector, right? That's also a benefit that can fit right into the discussion of a constitutional requirement to maximize the benefit of our natural resources. Okay. Whatever agreement you get benefits the most Alaskans possible with regard to the cost of the gas to Alaskans, right? But if the people sitting at this table don't care about the private economy nearly as much as they care about the revenue coming to state government, then their bias is the constitutional provision is telling us that we have to maximize the taxes that are coming to the state government. And again, this is some of this thinking, and this is going to take us down a rabbit hole that I'm not going to allow myself to go down right now. The fact that we don't have a non-gas, non-oil revenue measure for the state of Alaska, that it's minimal, and I'm talking the only thing we got is a corporate income tax, means the growth of the private economy doesn't matter to these decision makers. It isn't a legitimate factor because it doesn't any growth that comes from the natural gas, providing low-cost natural gas to the private industry, unless that new company is a C Corp and it's a large corporation and it's paying corporate income tax, there's no increase in revenue to the state government from that economic activity. So these legislators are looking at it and they're saying, in their mind, they're making the math that says, well, I don't really care that the private economy would grow because of gas availability. It doesn't help me pay for government. It doesn't help me put more programs and services and take care of more people. It doesn't help me do that. What does help me is maximizing the tax benefit for this project. Okay. So we're going to take a look and say, well, we've got a 20 mil requirement right now. Why do we need to come off that? Why do we need to come off it? If the alternative to the gas line project is importing natural gas or LNG, turning it into natural gas, if that's the alternative and you're okay with that alternative, then why do we have to come off this? I think that's a legitimate question that these senators should be asking. Why do you think that the property tax limit needs to be reduced? They're probably going to tell you that they don't want to reduce it.
Follow up, Senator Kawasaki.
Then thank you. And property taxes, I'm pretty sure this is the way, like if you have a home, the property taxes aren't 100% at the first, it also grades up as the construction begins and as it ends, then it peaks at some point and then it goes back down. So does that, I guess I'm trying to track it to
He's unaware.
apples to apples again with, I'm a property taxpayer. What happens in that case?
Through the chair, that's an excellent question, Senator Kawasaki. So as it happens, I think it was HB4 back in 2014 maybe, which has already ameliorated the property tax burden on the project by delaying it until first gas. So in this instance, under the current property tax arrangement, it would become payable once the project starts to produce LNG.
Okay, so let me translate that for you into real people speak. Our current statute doesn't require property tax to be paid until they start producing gas. So under current tax regime, current tax law, the 20 mils doesn't get paid until they start producing gas. So all of the construction phase up until the day they start producing gas, there's no tax. He called it ameliorated. It's reduced, it's eliminated. It's not subsidized, but the technical term escaping me right at the moment, but it's reduced to nothing. You don't have to pay it. They don't have to pay it. Okay. So there is none. Fast forward to the conversation to the bill that they're referencing, 280, Senate Bill 280, that the governor's brought forward with regard to the transition to a throughput tax. That bill also keeps that in place and says there's not going to be a tax through this process of building construction, right? They're calling it a ramp up period, I think is the ramp up, the term. Anyway, point is, current statute, no property tax until we've got first gas.
Thanks.
Senator Wielkowski.
Thank you. I want a gas line just as much as anybody in this committee, but I have a hard time giving saying, I guess, to communities, you have to reduce your property taxes without seeing the books. Like, is this padding investor profits? Is this required to get a hurdle rate? I guess that's my.
Okay, so this is envy. This is envy speaking. Okay. You've got a 20 mil rate that you're not even going to be paying. You're not even going to be charging them under current law until they start paying, producing gas. Okay. And under current law, then you'd be charging them 2%. And you want to see their books because you want to know whether coming off of that 20% is going to mean that they make more profit. What's your alternative? Senator Wielkowski, what's your alternative? You said, I want a gas line as bad as the next person. You do? Because I'm telling you that I don't care whether they're paying 2% or 1% or 0%. I want to see long-term natural gas coming to this state of Alaska for the benefit of Alaskans. And that, in my mind, meets the constitutional requirement of maximizing the benefit to all Alaskans. Okay. We're going to make some tax money off of it. Of course we will. There's nobody saying that we're not going to have some sort of taxation on the pipeline after construction. Okay. Whatever project, whatever direction we go, there's going to be some sort of taxation. Okay. But if you're tying that decision to how much profit the company is going to make because it's a private company, well, then that's just greed talking. You should be happy with the taxation that you're putting in place or not. And if you're not happy with the taxation that you're putting in place, then find an alternative. If it's not Glenfarne, what is it going to be? And the only alternative that they have right now is importing LNG. So who stands to gain if we go down that road? If for some reason we decide, well, we're not willing to come off our 20 mils. Well, if it scuttles the project, does it matter to you? Because now we're going to be importing LNG. And if that is something that you're acceptable to you, meaning it meets your other goals, like this Democrat right here, their party would like to see the elimination of natural gas and oil development in the state of Alaska. That's already part of their platform. Okay. So he can say in this committee meeting, well, I'd like to see a pipeline as much as everybody else, because I don't want to have their criticism of saying, well, I would rather we have imported LNG, and I don't really care that Glenfarne is successful here. I would rather this not go forward. He's not going to say that. He's not going to admit it. So the question is, what do you think is the right taxation? It has nothing to do with how much profit they're going to make. What do you think the right amount of taxation is compared to all of the other projects that are out there? What is the state's right amount of taxation? And if you can come to a number that you can agree to and they can agree to, then the project moves forward. If not, then go find somebody else to build your project. Don't let greed and envy of somebody else's success get in the way of you making a good financial decision for the state of Alaska.
My fundamental question is, how do we make this decision without knowing what the numbers are?
Thank you, Senator Wielechowski, through the chair. We've touched on this topic already once or twice in this hearing, and there are probably legislative and regulatory processes at play here, which in an ideal world would rely on quite significant disclosures about cost and profiles and so forth. Although it's not a topic for today, for example, the determination of a tariff for the pipeline through the RCA, I believe the RCA regulatory framework would typically require quite significant disclosures. I don't know, from a confidentiality point of view, I don't know how far those disclosures have to go, but certainly, in terms of making a disclosure or making a determination which is clearly in the public interest to Alaskan citizens, some level of that disclosure might be appropriate. A point I've made before, and I think the previous speakers sort of intimated at this, it's quite common for a project to create what's called an open book economic model, which allows stakeholders to come at a project like this from a standard perspective. But you can put your own assumptions in terms of oil price, discount rate, cost of capital, all those things which are proprietary. You keep outside the open book model. But nonetheless, it does provide a common basis for dialogue, particularly when, very large sums of money are being discussed.
So would that be your recommendation, that we require or perhaps begin by requesting an open book economic model from Glenfarne?
I believe it would be an appropriate request to be made. Back in 2014, an open book economic model existed for the previous incarnation of the project, and it was used by the state and the other companies involved to arrive at determinations around things like property tax.
Thank you. The other interesting thing on your slide here is the third bullet, the reduction you're portraying here is limited to 10 years. I've heard comments that perhaps a property tax reduction in our state would go in perpetuity, last the whole time. So that's interesting. Is the 10 years pretty typical? I thought you had said that, but I wasn't sure.
The 10 years, Chair Giesel, is baked into the legislation, the Louisiana statute that applies to these major capital projects. And coming back to my earlier point, for a project developer, relief in the first 10 years of the project is very much more significant than in subsequent periods of time. And so, to some extent, many of these LNG projects exist around a kind of a balance between mitigating near-term costs, which heavily impact the economics of the project, and then longer-term benefits where, a government or sovereign stakeholder might have more opportunity to look for ways to develop value.
Thank you. Further questions? Seeing none, I'll let you go to the next slide.
Thank you, Chair Giesel.
Opportunities to develop value. If the state is really looking at ways to increase its taxation, its revenue, it should be looking to its private economy to support the government. And not just one sector of the private economy, which is what we're having a conversation about tonight, just the gas portion of the economy. The whole economy that would benefit from gas, we ought to be considering as a source of revenue for the state, because that the implication to the legislature at that point is that we care what happens to that private economy because it's providing revenue to the state. Okay? Those incentives matter to the decision makers that are sitting at that table. And right now, that's not considered. We don't consider that because there's no benefit to the state government. I feel like a broken record on this.
So the next slide relates to Texas. And you'll see a summary at the top there in terms of how property tax is allocated across different local authorities. So you've got the county, city, port authority, if applicable, and the school district. So you'll note there that the school district mill rate is the largest contribution. And up until the end of 2022, a very similar mechanism existed to that in Louisiana. But following a reform and a kind of a sunsetting of some of those property tax concessions, the subsequent regulatory arrangements excluded school district taxation.
Okay, so we're talking apples to apples here with regard to Alaska's 20 mil current tax rate, 20 mil being 2%. So that means the school district's largest percentage is 10 mils, right? 1% is 10 mils. And then your 0.1 would then be, what is that, 1 mil? 0.1 would be 1 mil or less for the smaller percentages. So it's less than a mil for each one of these other entities, jurisdictions. That's the Texas model. Now, Texas also has a higher property tax rate for people, for homes, than what Alaska does as well. No income tax, but high property tax.
So effectively, it more or less halved the property tax available. So you'll see on this chart number of projects there that had the full property tax relief. And you can see there some very significant numbers. Corpus Christi LNG, $1.25 billion. And again, just to put that into context, Corpus Christi will be expanding to about 50 million tons per annum, so 2.5 times bigger than Alaska LNG. And that's one of the reasons for that very large number. In general, in terms of doing the math on this, a good rule of thumb is to say that Gulf Coast liquefaction costs about $1,000 or $1,200 a ton of annual capacity. So, from that you can essentially derive an approximate capital cost of some of these facilities and get some sense of the significance of these property tax relief numbers. Again, on this chart, Glen Farn was successful in achieving property tax concessions from the essentially the local government, and the number is relatively low for a couple of reasons. First of all, because it uses the new property tax concession approach. And secondly, it's worth remembering that the Texas LNG project is 4 million tons per annum. So again, if you compare that to Corpus Christi with its 50, you can see why some of these numbers are disproportionate like that.
Very good. I'll let you go to the next slide.
Thank you. So it's perhaps not an obvious example, but Maryland is quite a good example, I think, for Alaska. So this property tax PILT actually relates to the Cove Point LNG facility. As some of you may know, Cove
PILT is payment in lieu of taxes.
Point was built back in the 80s as an LNG regas terminal, but in the end was mothballed for decades, because there was no LNG coming into the US. So for a long time, and perhaps this comes back to our question about disclosure, for a long time, the Cove Point facility was regulated under the PUC. So in the same way that a distribution company would be regulated on its assets, so was Cove Point. It then switched to being...
So that means, I'm pretty sure that the PUC is Public Utility Commission. That's probably what he means. So he's pointing out that the liquefaction plant or terminal there was regulated under the PUC, which is similar in nature, I think, to our RCA, so that it's regulated underneath that.
An LNG export terminal. And so in the early days of that, 2013, a decision was made to move to a PILT type arrangement. And the main reasons for that were that the local county were concerned about volatility in their tax income. Equally, it was felt that encouraging a capital asset of that scale was a positive thing to do. So that PILT ended in 2018, and it reverted back to conventional property tax appraisals with a 40% discount. Interestingly, what they found was that there were then a set of differing expectations around valuation of the asset. There was some volatility around county income, which affected schools. And in fact, it came to a head in 2023 when there was a very significant shortage in school budget, simply because of the way in which the county relied on that one facility. So in 2024, they decided to go back to a PILT. And in fact, it was retroactive as well to address some of these budgetary issues that they'd encountered. So, a very interesting example, communities that were relying on one big asset for their taxable income. And certainly the conclusion that they came to was that a PILT was better than having to deal with the uncertainties around property tax. Interestingly, depending on which analysis you use, if you use the state valuation of the asset, the PILT is actually higher than the property tax would be. But if you use the county's evaluation, it's lower. So good example of a compromise being reached in the interests of all parties.
Any questions on that slide? Senator Clayman.
On a theme, how much information did Maryland have with respect to the economics and the balance sheets and everything else of that project when they were making these decisions?
You can see a theme here that all of the Democrats, liberals, pro-government people on this committee are absolutely worried and fixated on the fact that you've got a private company and we want to know what their financials are and whether they're going to be making more money than we think they should make?
That's an excellent question, Senator Clayman, through the chair. I don't have that information, but I think, if we were to dig into this a little more closely, it would be easier to establish. It's not strictly relevant to these circumstances, but perhaps for the benefit of the committee and people watching at home, one of the important differences between Alaska LNG and, say, LNG Canada is that the pipeline built by TransCanada for the LNG Canada terminal was privately funded. There were direct negotiations between the pipeline builder and operator and LNG Canada. And as we've heard from our previous speakers, actually from Pegasus, that there were private arrangements arrived at in terms of the tariff and how cost increases would be dealt with. The difference between that and the phase one gas line here is that for the first few years, at least, of the pipeline project, the beneficiaries of that pipeline are regular gas and ratepayers in South Central and potentially Fairbanks and elsewhere. So in that scenario, disclosure becomes more important because a public interest determination has to be made. So it's just helpful to think that this pipeline has a very different purpose, for example, to others that you might see elsewhere. If that's helpful.
That's very helpful. Yes, for us to keep in mind. Senator Myers.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So, Mr. Fulford, I guess what's going through my mind is, we're talking about a long-term change in the property tax. You're suggesting, you're looking at Louisiana saying 10 years. The chair has already mentioned there's been one suggestion out there that we make it in perpetuity, whatever the reduction is. I guess what I'm concerned with is, a PILT sounds like an interesting way to try to get around it, but we still come back to our constitutional prohibition on we can't contract away our taxing authority. So even if we as a current legislature and the current administration come to an agreement 5 years down the road, 10 years down the road, whatever may be applicable, we still can't stop a future legislature or future administration from attempting to change that. And from everything that we're getting from Glenn Farn and other parties involved, effectively what they're asking for is we need, certainty as much as possible. We want this set in stone. And even though a PILT, I think, probably heads in that direction with our current constitutional language, it sounds to me like it's impossible in the long run.
This is a similar argument, and I just want to pause here for just a second and show you a similarity. This is a similar argument for why conservatives especially would point to any sort of a sales tax or income tax, a broad-based tax of some sort, flat tax or whatever, and say, well, they're going to start at this rate. They're going to start at 1% or 2%, but there's nothing to stop the legislature from coming in later and changing that to 3%, 4%, and just grow, because the legislature is going to demand more money going forward. And that's the way that it's going to be. And if we say yes to this tax now, then it'll be more in the future. I don't disagree at all. I think that's the pressure. That's the continual pressure. That is the way of things. It is like the sun comes up in the east and sets in the west. People that are sitting on this committee are going to be looking for ways to generate more revenue, tax more people in any government, anywhere you go. That is the way of life. So whether it is an income tax or a sales tax or a flat tax or a property tax or a pipeline property tax, there's always going to be a legislature who retains the power to come in and change things, when the future dictates. So what you really ought to be asking the question is, how do we create a system, a tax regime, a plan here that works in and puts in place the right incentives. Okay. So for example, if you have a property tax and that's how you're going to collect your revenue, then the incentive is you want more revenue, you either raise the rate or you raise the valuation. So why would the state or the entity, if it was a borough, why would they get sued on a valuation? An assessment, property tax value assessment. I'm not saying evaluation, I'm saying valuation, no E, the assessment. Why in the future, at any point in time, would some entity get sued by somebody on the property tax assessment? Because the incentive is for somebody to think that the value of the property needs to be more so that state government receives more in taxation. And so as long as you've got somebody on your payroll, you've got a lawyer to turn to file a lawsuit against the entity, they can challenge the assessment on that piece of property. And the reason that they're doing that is because they're incentivized to do it. They want more revenue coming to that entity, whether it's the state or the borough. And so that incentive exists. Okay. What is the valuation incentive for the alternative tax that they're putting on a throughput of the gas? What's the incentive that is created there? Okay. Well, the incentive, if you want more revenue, is to change the rate that you're charging through the throughput, or more throughput. So if the incentive is to provide more gas, then you would want more development on the North Slope to find more gas, provide more exportation of the gas, and with that more throughput, the state or the entity receives more revenue. That's the incentive you put in place. You always have to fight the fight about what the rate is that's being charged. It doesn't matter what tax you're going to have to fight that rate. But you don't have the incentive where someone's coming by and suing you and saying, well, you're not putting enough through the pipeline. You need to be putting more through the pipeline. Okay. Same thing with a property tax. With a sales tax. You're incentivizing the economic activity. The more your economy grows, the more revenue comes to the state government. The more jobs that you have, the more employees that you have in your state under a income tax, the more revenue there is to the state government. So that's the incentive that you're creating for decision makers, is to make that activity happen, support that activity that creates jobs. In Alaska, we don't have that incentive. We have the opposite incentive. If you have people coming into the state and new workers and they bring their family in, it actually costs municipalities and it costs the state more with regard to education or with roads and corrections, police force, state troopers, all of that. The cost goes up if you've got more people coming into the state, and there's no mechanism that collects more revenue because you've got more people in the state. So it's the backwards incentive that we have in our tax structure within the state. This is why a fiscal plan going forward needs to address some of these structural problems that we have. Here's a perfect opportunity. Let's not do property tax. Let's change it to a throughput tax and take away this perverse incentive. We want the incentive to be on production. More jobs on the North Slope if you have more gas being produced, right? More gas fields means more jobs. That means more revenue to the state. So that's the incentive that you want to create.
Thank you for the question, Senator Myers. And it's through the chair. It's a question which also came up during SB 138, given that the framework around SB 38, one of the purposes of that framework was to provide a fiscal framework and fiscal stability going forward.
SB 38 is the bill that created the current LNG project, put AK LNG on the map, created AGDC, and said, "Here we're gonna finally get to a state to a gas pipeline. Excuse me, to a gas pipeline."
You've highlighted the constitutional constraints around the way in which taxes get set in the state. And I believe some work was done by the Department of Law at the time to make an assessment in terms of how fiscal stability for a project of this scale and magnitude would be reconciled with some of these other constitutional constraints. And I'm sure the same questions would arise this time. You know, the previous speakers were speaking to the role that lenders, for example, have in a project like this. And one of the things that lenders would be top of their list to look at would be fiscal framework and stability. And part of that would be just an appraisal around the jurisdiction, the regulatory and legislative framework that applies there, because certainly, already Alaska is a well-defined and well-governed framework compared to many places around the world that host LNG. But, conceivably, they could be looking further than that at some kind of degree of assurance or certainty.
Remember also that at the time that this meeting happened on the 23rd of January, we didn't have a proposal for a volumetric tax. That it wasn't part of the discussion yet. The conversation doesn't know that is going to happen in the future, and which is what we're facing right now. So that different structure conversation is not something that he would have had knowledge of.
Other questions? Senator Clayman.
A little bit of a return to an earlier question. I'm working on that. I believe that Glenfarne has a fairly detailed model that they're working with to piece all these things together. In the world of what's confidential and not, is it in the realm that we could be saying to Glenfarne, you can't give us all the data that's in your model, but give us the model that you have, and we can put our own numbers in and actually see. I mean, we might not actually be putting in the same numbers that they have, but we could actually see what they're doing, how they've put the model together. Is that in the realm of something we could potentially request from Glenfarne to try to get a better understanding of how they've structured this package?
Thank you, Senator Clayman, through the chair. With any global project development like this, the way in which the dialogue is handled between the project developers and the host government, that there are different ways of approaching it, and a lot depends on the way in which the project developer wishes to lead that through. Clearly, as I think you've contained in your comments today, that there are certain decisions by the state which would be quite difficult to make without some degree of disclosure around the costs and the broad economics of the project. Because thinking of other jurisdictions where we are involved in a similar kind of discussion, that there usually has to be some degree of exchange. And I can think of other examples that we're looking at today on other continents where the open book economic model is a vital tool to frame the dialogue between government and project developer.
Okay, so this open book economic model conversation, I have not heard in the conversations in the meetings that are happening now in April. Okay. I don't know whether the legislature, the resources committee decided that they don't want to go down that road and have that conversation. They haven't asked Glenfarne to participate in that model. I don't know to be honest, I don't know the advantages of what the recommendation here is for the state of Alaska. Okay. I don't have any judgment on that right now. Well, all I'm saying is our paid consultant asked us or identified to us a model or a way to try to solve the conversation that he knows what they're getting after because he's identifying it. It's the same conversation they have everywhere. You got a private company come in, and the public entity, the state or the government, in some cases that's a country, is like, well, we want to be taken care of in taxes, but we want them to produce. So if we ask for too much taxes, they're not going to produce. So what's the right number of taxes that you'll accept and still produce? That's what we're getting at. And that's what these people are saying. That's what they want. They're like, the value of this project is in how much the state government's going to get in taxes. We have a responsibility to make sure we tax you to the maximum extent that we can. That's what the Constitution says. So how do we get to that number? How do we know what the maximum about to tax you is? That's what they got to figure out. Using this open model might be a tool to get to that thing, right? To that number. Again, I have a sneaking suspicion that if AGDC had to come to the legislature and said, hey, we're thinking about bringing on Glenfarne to manage this project, these people that are on this committee and the resources committee would not have approved. They would have never went to a private entity, a private company, and said, yeah, will you please build our pipeline for us? They would never have done that. They want a government-run pipeline project. That's what they want, where everything's transparent. And you know what that means? And this is why Glenfarne doesn't want to give up their proprietary numbers, because as soon as they do, everywhere up and down the model, all of your contractors, they're going to know exactly where their negotiating point is. So everything becomes more expensive. And that's what you find in government projects, because everybody that's sitting at the trough is going to nickel and dime that government. They're going to charge the maximum they possibly can get from government because it's all free money. That's the model of the government-run entity, and that's why it's never going to work for the state of Alaska. Now, you bring in a private company, and things can be managed a whole lot better, but it requires you to negotiate. This whole concept of negotiation means you don't spill all of your details to the person you're negotiating with. If that other person is willing to do the job at the price that you're willing to pay them, then you have an agreement. If they're unwilling, then you either increase the amount of money you're willing to pay them, or you find somebody else to do the job. And if you can't find anybody, then that means you have to increase the money. But you don't start the negotiation with saying, hey, gee, whatever you tell us you want for this, we'll just do that. And that's in essence what you're doing if you make all of your your financials available to the public. You can just throw negotiation out the window. There is no negotiation anymore. People are going to stick it to the project for maximum benefit to themselves. This is how the private sector does it. It's why it's successful. It's why they're able to maintain discipline on a project. No. With regard to this, Craig, they're not listening. If they're not, let's say maybe they're listening, but they're not internalizing it. It's not solving their problem. Their problem is that they have they know back in January, they've got a private company. They're not happy with the private company. And they're just learning now that they've got to figure out a way to deal with this answer that they're going to have to give an answer to. Back in January, they knew they were going to have a conversation about property tax. Now, March, it's coming due. They've got, in March it started. Now it's April. They have to find a solution by the end of the session or go into a special session to fix it, right? To find the solution. And they don't technically in January want to have a conversation about this because they don't like the fact that we're having to deal with a private company and they can't force them to give the financials. So you have to go back to the foundation, to the fundamentals here of the conversation and say the value of the project, you as the resource owner, that's us, Alaskans, and our representatives in the legislature. Do you want a pipeline built? And do you have an alternative to the current project? If you have the alternative, then play hardball. Tell them, no, we're not going to be giving you a property tax assessment because we know this other property tax assessment abatement. We're not going to reduce the property taxes because we know this other company over here, they'll build the pipeline and they don't need a property tax abatement. Okay. But we don't have that. So the legislators are like, man, we really want to maximize how much we're going to get, but we don't know what's going to run Glenfarne off. We don't want to be left holding the bag and say, because we wouldn't come down on taxes, the whole project goes away. Unless that's actually the goal, unless that's okay with you. If the alternative, because you don't have another company that's going to build the pipeline, if the alternative is importing LNG and that's okay with you, then much of this conversation is dog and pony. It's dog and pony. It's just we have to put on the show. We're not going to play ball with Glenfarne because we're okay with importing LNG. That is just as plausible in my mind. It's more plausible than finding another company to do what Glenfarne is doing. Or find a company that does it the way the legislature wants to do it with a state-run entity where AGDC owns the project and you hire a developer to come on and work for you and develop the project underneath AGDC as the owner. That didn't work. All the other private entities that we started with, the big majors, Conoco, BP, Exxon, they all said, no, we don't want to do that. Now here's Glenfarne. They said they want to build a pipeline for us. You want to maximize taxes, or do you want to make sure the pipeline gets built?
Mr. Fulford, thank you. We are at slide 7. The next slide begins the subject of Canadian Pacific Coast projects. We are at 5 o'clock. So thank you for agreeing to be joining us again on Monday.
Okay, so they're done with this meeting, and we're at an hour and a half. I'm going to save. So here's what we're going to do. Tomorrow, we're going to catch up with the second half of this meeting and find out what happened in Canada. And then we're going to have a conversation about catch up with Senate Resources on what they're having a conversation with, like today's meeting. So we'll catch up on that. We don't have time to do all of this tonight because it's, hours long meetings and there's just not enough time. So we're going to have to catch up on this, but we do need to hear what happened in Canada because that's a pertinent discussion. I don't have that teed up for us tonight. So we'll come back tomorrow and we'll address that, and we'll address what happened in Senate Resources today. Okay. Thanks for participating. I hope this is helpful. We've got a few comments here. If you want a warm fuzzy, you can turn your Siri on your phone into a British voice. If that makes things more confident, you want to hear that on a daily basis, you can just turn your Siri voice into a British accent, or Australian if you prefer the novel. I'm kidding, Craig. Rick says the LNG line is a pipe dream. No pun intended. The legislature will screw it up. Glenfarne will walk. Got in late. That is a possibility, Rick. I would, if I was a betting man, I would say, yeah, I think the legislature is more likely than not to screw it up. That's what I would expect as well. Okay, we talked about Baker Hughes. So Lisa said earlier in the meeting, Baker Hughes was incorporated in acquired by Baker Hughes in 2018. 2008. That doesn't necessarily mean that the legislature doesn't do their due diligence. It just means that in 2008, GaffneyCline was like, without checking, I'm pretty confident that they were a consultant for the state of Alaska. It just means that there wasn't a conflict between the state of Alaska and GaffneyCline with regard to Baker Hughes. Glenfarne wasn't a thing, right? And the relationship between Baker Hughes and Glenfarne wasn't a thing. So I guess I'm thinking on the fly here. We have asked GaffneyCline to come on and give us advice in the oil and gas industry generically. Let's just leave it at that. There are reasons why we've asked them specific questions over the past when we're talking about taxation since 2008. And Baker Hughes is on the North Slope. They do business in the state of Alaska. Was that an issue at any time that GaffneyCline has been a consultant for the state of Alaska? I don't know. I just think it's an easy thing for the unprofessionals on this committee to pick at the current situation. They don't want a private company being in charge of this pipeline. And now that things have changed in GaffneyCline, I mean, it's small-mindedness. It's nitpicky. If you don't want to trust GaffneyCline, then go find a different consultant. Otherwise, quit bitching about it. Do your due diligence. If you want to require them to provide you the agreement of what information is not going to be shared with their parent company, then do your due diligence. But dragging this guy through the mud in the public like this is unprofessional and not necessary. You're just grandstanding. That's all this is. You see a conflict of interest. Which conflict of interest, Christopher? Well, I should think so. Rick says there's record LNG sales in the lower 48 today. Considering that the country of America is now theoretically in control of the Strait of Hormuz, I was thinking it's a blockade. Blockade, is that the right word? The Navy has blockaded the Strait of Hormuz and now we control the transit. That's going to have an impact on the LNG that's being shipped through the Strait of Hormuz and the whole problem with Iran. So it doesn't surprise me in the least that demand has gone way up for LNG and that prices have gone up. Christopher says we have no way to transport LNG to the U.S. Don't have a ship to do that. Yeah, right. So there is not an alternative plan. There is an idea that we could build a liquefaction plant on the North Slope and then ship LNG south. And the scale of that enterprise is significantly smaller than building a pipeline and being able to take it from Tidewater in South Central Alaska to ultimate destinations. It would be less product moving by ship, and you have to deal with the ice, and we don't have enough icebreakers, or don't have enough icebreakers yet to be able to manage that endeavor. I don't think it's feasible at this point. Baker Hughes works for the producers and it's never been a problem. Yeah, I mean, that's what I'm saying. GaffneyCline has been a consultant for the state of Alaska for many, 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 many years, decades. And when Baker Hughes came on, like this is the first time we're hearing about it. Maybe it's my perception or I wasn't listening and it's been a problem before, but I don't think so. I mean, all the time that I was looking for a consultant and we were discussing GaffneyCline, no one in the legislature brought up the point that we shouldn't have GaffneyCline because they're owned by Baker Hughes. No one brought that up. I wasn't aware of it. It wasn't something that I ever considered. I'm looking at GaffneyCline. I'm saying we've been doing business with GaffneyCline for decades. There's not an alternative. When I put this out, an RFI out, GaffneyCline's the only one that came back and said, yeah, we'll be your consultant. Nobody else wanted to do it. We did have a nibble or some interest from a company in Texas, but that was, it didn't go anywhere. They didn't actually put forward a proposal to be the consultant. Yeah, I'd suspend or get rid of the Jones Act. That'd help for Alaska. Yeah, I'm not sure about that. I think Senator Wielkowski was being political, but I think he and Giesel are working together on this. The icebreaker deal got suspended in Seattle. Yeah, I read something about the port. They were going to put they're home basing the icebreakers there or Coast Guard cutters or something. And I'm struggling. I don't remember exactly what the article said about the port there in Seattle being delayed or put on hold or scuttled, or I don't remember. But the point is, Sullivan has been successful in getting money appropriated for icebreakers, and they need to be constructed and then come to Alaska at some point in time. I have not kept up on the plan on that. Anyway, I guess the relevant point is that the shortage of icebreakers for the United States means it isn't as feasible to look at moving LNG via the Arctic Ocean by ship down to Asia, as much as it is building a pipeline and moving it from Nikiski to Asia. So maybe that problem's solvable, and you can get an icebreaker built, and you can solve that problem. I don't know. All I know is that the scale of that project, the amount of LNG that you're moving, is a whole lot less than what you'd be moving through the pipeline. Craig's asking a question here. I just wonder if the producers have expressed some interest under the table to do the AKLNG since conditions have improved. No. Well, I don't know that they haven't, but here's what I would say. And I'm going to throw some numbers out here because I think this is kind of fairly accurate, or what I remember hearing. The majors needed a project like this to be profitable, just like Glenfarne needs the project to be profitable. Okay. But the definition of profitable is different for each company. Okay. This is one of the things the legislature has to grapple with. Your majors stepped out because for them, profitable means 18% return. Glenfarne is okay with 10% return. So why can you have a private entity step in now versus private entities that weren't engaged or didn't want to engage later? So it's scale. It's I don't know what the right word is. It's the type of company they are. It's the financials, the fundamentals of them doing business. Exxon gets involved in something and they need to have a higher profit margin. Glenfarne doesn't have to have that higher profit margin. So the project is feasible for them where it wasn't feasible for another larger company that demands their shareholders demand a larger profit. So I don't think that there's interest in those majors stepping in because it's still not going to be 18% profitable. You're never going to get that. The margins are smaller on this project than the major companies, large companies want to take on. That's not what their business model does. So that's why I think no to that answer. I will stand corrected if someone can point me to an alternative. But at this point in time, Glenfarne is it. They're the project that is sitting here with the state. There isn't an alternative that has come up on the net that says we've got the money, we've got the resources, we've got the relationships, we got the time and the expertise and all of that. Nobody else is saying that. Now, back when Glenfarne was awarded this, there was another entity that was associated with former Governor Walker that thought they wanted to be the man. They wanted to be Glenfarne. But that didn't materialize. That was a Governor Walker and union project. And that would have been unions running the show. So therein lies maybe another rub here with a bunch of Democrats on the committee who are pro-union people, public sector union. Perhaps that's one of the motivations behind the scenes here is they're like, if we can find a way to get rid of Glenfarne next year, we could be having a conversation with Governor Walker and the unions, and we can get this project running in our terms. Maybe that's one of the things that somebody's thinking. I don't know. It's clear to me that the people on this committee do not want this private company to move forward. That's why they stripped it out of their resolution that was going forward to support a project instead of this project. To me, that's very clear. They do not want and do not trust this project, this developer. What about developing ANWR? I know it's in the courts, but you would push with the Trump administration. In regards to the pipeline or just in general, we should be looking to expand our economy by developing ANWR. I've got no complaint there. I mean, that's obviously more economic activity on the North Slope would benefit the state of Alaska and the nation, but provide jobs. And honestly, as Glenfarne's going to find out when they go to build this project, there isn't going to be the workforce in Alaska to sustain it. That is the sad truth. We have atrophied our workforce so that a major project like this cannot be sustained by Alaskans. We're going to have to import workers from around the world, lower 48 and elsewhere, to do the work because we don't have the people. We've lost it. That's what electing Democrats at the national level who want to eliminate or reduce or prevent oil and gas development on the North Slope and elsewhere in Cook Inlet, why they want to make that more difficult, why they want to prevent it. Well, decades later, you end up without the workforce to be able to support any kind of activity like that. I mean, this is insidious. Alaska is a resource state. The people who live here have a God-given right to decide their direction and grow their economy and have the benefits of the fruit of our labor. Except the federal government says, no, you can't do that. You can't labor that. You can't pump oil. It's frustrating. Sad. That's right, Rick. It's sad. Yep. It's sad. All right, guys, I got to run. Thanks for joining me tonight, and we'll see you tomorrow night, 7 p.m. Tomorrow would be Wednesday. Yep, sounds good. Okay, have a good night. Oh, I have to share something with you. Give me 1 second here. Let me tee it up. This is what you call suspense. Almost there. Here it is. There it is. For you that were wondering. Today was her due date. So we were Our family was, oh, hey, look, we're going to have a calf because this is the first time that we've gone through having a calf. And it looked like she was going to have the calf 2 weeks ago. And lo and behold, we could have just relaxed because she knew she was going to have it on this day because this is her due date. Anyway, that's the calf. That is a purebred Hereford. The mother of the cow is a purebred Hereford. So is the calf. She was AI'd, and the bull is somewhere down in the lower 48. We have a second cow. My daughter's cows. She has a second cow, and that cow had a miscarriage a couple weeks ago. Oh no, last week, and she had twins, and both of them were stillborn. So it's been a roller coaster ride the last few days because that was something that we were like that cow was not due until June. So this we're looking really closely and watching what's happening with this cow because she's expecting to have a baby and the other one miscarries, and we're not even like, what do you mean? We didn't even notice you were going into labor. So it's been sad. Anyway, yeah, that cow was born midday today, and that picture is right. I don't know. She's dried off, so she's a couple hours old, but not more than that. Let me make it a little bigger here. I don't know. Maybe that's a big deal in Alaska because we don't have many cows in Alaska. I mean, there's some cattle farmers, but not a lot. Yay, in Alaska, we celebrate the birth of one heifer. Anyway, it's a little, got to start somewhere, right? So now my daughter's herd is growing by one. Good for her. And she's doing an outstanding job tending to her flock or her herd. Anyway, when do you order meat? Craig says. Well, this heifer the intent is for her to be a breeding heifer later. So we're not eating her. Had there been a male born, maybe that would have been a, like the other cow was a Hereford mix, Hereford cross. And she was bred to a Highland. And had she had her babies would have been for meat, most likely. And just so happens that they had she had one male and one female, which means that the female is going to come out sterile. And anyway, so both of them, if they went to term and were born, would probably both been food. Anyway. Yeah, Rick, I'm not promoting jerseys on our little farm. I don't want a milk operation. We don't drink enough milk to justify that, and the time involved, somebody else would have to do that. We've got goats. We've got a herd of goats out here that we could be doing, and we have in the past pulled a little bit of milk from them, but we just don't do enough milk around here to justify doing something like that. I suppose if the apocalypse came and and we couldn't get food, we'd have milk and cheese, and we'd have to be more self-sufficient. But that's not something that we've chosen to do on our little farm. Christopher asked what the name is, and my daughter has not named it yet. I don't even really know what all of the names are in the running, and I don't know. I guess with this calf, I'm a little bit more not concerned, but I care a little bit more because I know that it's not going to be food. But I'll be honest, many of the animals around here that get names are food. I'm like, I don't really care to know you as something that's got a name because I'm the one who's going to have to do the deed and butcher it, or at least put it down. You're not a pet. If you're food, you're not a pet. I don't care what your name is. You're food. Food 1, food 2, food 3. And I don't need to get to know you as an animal, as a named animal. Anyway, I do not need more goats, Rick. No more goats. We have enough. We've already butchered a couple of them and put them in the freezer, and that's good. We don't need more. I tell you, if I didn't put my foot down, we'd have llamas and we'd have donkeys and we'd have horses, and I mean, they'd be all over the place. Anyway, I say like I put my foot down. Anyway. All right, thanks for joining me tonight. Been fun, and glad we can dialogue. I hope this provides some feedback here. Was it helpful to take a look back at the conversations that happened in January with regard to consultant advice on taxation? If you don't want to see it, then we can skip that. The second half of that meeting that's talking about Canada. I think it's going to be pertinent to us and to the conversation that the legislature is going to be engaged in, and very pertinent to the conversation going on right now. So we can catch up with what's happening in the committee. They haven't made any amendments to the bill yet, so nothing really to get involved too heavily in. Anyway. Yeah, Rick, that's the problem. You make yourself a public figure, and then you've got to get comfortable with people knowing all the little details in your life. Anyway, I'm happy to do it. I'm happy to do it. If it helps further the goal of getting people involved and aware of what's happening in state government, caring and growing the pool of people who are participating, then I'm more than willing to humiliate myself on a daily basis to put myself at risk, put it out there, because I care. I truly care, not about what it's going to bring me, but whether this state can move forward in a healthy manner that my kids and grandkids are going to benefit from. That's honest to God what my focus is. We got to turn the state around. We got to get some discipline involved. Got to get some better leaders, because none of that's going to happen without better leaders. And this is where it starts, helping people provide better oversight of what's happening. Learn, get involved and figure out what's actually happening. Anyway. Have a good night. We'll see you tomorrow.